Papua New Guinea, July 1942. The jungle breathes like a living thing. Thick mist coils around the trees. Clinging to the soldiers' faces, sweat runs cold down mud-streaked necks. A narrow ribbon of track, barely a meter wide, snakes up through the Owen Stanley Range. Swallowed by vines and silence, a group of Australians, most barely 20, edge forward. Their boots sink deep into the clay. Every step is a battle against the mountain. Behind them, porters carry ammunition and stretchers, the lifeline of the Kokoda Track somewhere ahead. The Japanese are moving too, their boots drum faintly in the valley fog, methodical. Endless, the men tighten their grips on Leon fields, hearts hammering against wet fabric. They've been called chocolate soldiers once, militia, not professional city kids from Melbourne. Mechanics, clerks, farmers, untrained, under-equipped, and expected to break. But on this jungle spine, beneath a sky that never stops raining, the young Australians are about to face one of the fiercest tests of courage in World War II. And those who laughed at them will soon learn why Kokoda became their grave in early 1942. The war in the Pacific was collapsing toward Australia's doorstep only months earlier. Japan had unleashed a lightning campaign across Southeast Asia, smashing British and Dutch colonies, conquering the Philippines, and taking Singapore. In what Winston Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history, for Australians, the fall of Singapore was a shattering moment. It wasn't just the loss of a fortress, it was the death of a myth, the belief that Britain could protect them, that the empire's reach guaranteed safety, vanished overnight in the same breath. Japan's forces swept south, seizing Rabaul on New Britain and threatening the island of New Guinea. If New Guinea fell, Northern Australia could be next. Darwin had already been bombed. Panic rippled through the country. The government in Canberra faced an unthinkable truth. Australia would have to defend itself, but with most of its professional troops still fighting in North Africa. The only available soldiers were militia, the citizen military forces, men who had never expected to see combat outside Australia's shores. Among them was the 39th Battalion, a unit of volunteers and part-time soldiers, most between 18 and 22 years old. They had trained for coastal defense, not jungle warfare. When word came that Japanese forces had landed on the north coast of Papua in July 1942, these young militia were sent to hold the Kokoda Track, a treacherous 96-kilometer path carved through the mountains from Port Moresby to the northern beaches. To military planners, it looked like a simple supply route. To those who walked it, it became hell itself. The Japanese goal was clear: advance over land via the Kokoda Track, capture Port Moresby, and use it as a base to isolate Australia from the United States. If Port Moresby fell, Australia would be cut off, perhaps even forced into surrender. Men of the 39th were dispatched to delay them. No one believed they could stop them. The Japanese troops who began the advance were battle-hardened veterans of the Imperial Japanese Army, many from the 144th Regiment. Experienced in jungle warfare from the Malayan and Burmese campaigns, they were confident, disciplined, and had known nothing but victory since 1937. Facing them were Australian teenagers with hand-me-down rifles, limited ammunition, and almost no medical support. Their uniforms rotted in the constant rain. Malaria and dysentery spread faster than bullets. The odds were absurd, but they held at Kokoda village. The 39th Battalion met the Japanese vanguard in late July. They fought stubbornly, delaying the advance long enough for reinforcements, the seasoned 7th Division AIF, to be airlifted from the Middle East. Still, the Japanese pushed forward relentlessly through Diniki, Isurava, and Iora Creek. They clawed up the mountains, driving the Australians southward in brutal close quarters. Fighting, each ridge became a battlefield, each stream a graveyard. Yet something unexpected began to happen. The more the Australians fought, the more they adapted. The young militia learned the rhythm of the jungle, how to move silently, how to ambush, how to use terrain to offset their smaller numbers. And with every clash, Their legend grew. They were no longer chocolate soldiers. They were the men of Kokoda, the line that stood between Australia and invasion by late August. The campaign had become a desperate struggle of endurance. Food supplies vanished, ammunition ran low. Both sides were ravaged by disease, but the Japanese underestimated the mountains and the will of those who defended them. The Kokoda Track was not just a battlefield. It was a proving ground for a nation, and as Japanese forces pressed onward toward Port Moresby, believing the path to victory lay open, they were walking into a campaign that would grind their strength, drain their spirit, and break their momentum across the Pacific. The mist over the Owen Stanley Range thickened as August bled into September. Reinforcements from both sides converged. The battle for the mountains was about to enter its deadliest phase, where courage, exhaustion, and terrain would decide everything. By September 1942, the Kokoda Track had become a narrow thread of survival running through a living nightmare. The mountains towered like sentinels. The valleys choked with fog and death. Every step meant climbing, slipping, sweating, each bend revealing either salvation or ambush. The 39th Battalion, battered and emaciated, had held far longer than anyone expected. They had delayed the Japanese advance long enough for battle-hardened reinforcements. The 214th and 216th Battalions of the 7th Division to reach the front for the first time. Experienced AIF troops were entering the jungle, replacing the exhausted militia who had given everything. But what they saw stunned them. The survivors of the 39th were ghosts, hollow-eyed, covered in mud and leech bites, their uniforms in rags. Some could barely stand. They had fought, retreated, and fought again, often hand-to-hand against superior numbers. One officer described it simply: they looked like men who had been through hell. The Japanese, meanwhile, were closing in on Ioribaiwa Ridge, the last high ground before Port Moresby. If they could break through here, they would see the lights of the city across the plains. Victory seemed within reach in Tokyo. Imperial planners had already imagined the headlines. Port Moresby would fall, Australia would be cut off. The Pacific would belong to Japan, but in the field, the situation was changing. The long supply lines through the jungle were strangling the Japanese advance. Porters died by the hundreds. Under the weight of ammunition and rice sacks, tropical disease ripped through their ranks. Their rations were running out. Every meter gained was paid for in blood, and while the Japanese army prided itself on endurance, it was the Australians who were proving unbreakable. The 7th Division brought a new kind of fight: organized defense, aggressive patrols, ambush tactics. They were learning the jungle faster than the enemy expected. The Australians also had something else on their side: the terrain. The Owen Stanley Range was not just steep, it was punishing. Torrential rain turned paths into rivers of mud. Rifles jammed, radios failed, supply drops often missed their targets and vanished into the canopy below. But if the jungle punished both sides equally, it punished the attacker more. By mid-September, Japanese troops at Ioribaiwa were exhausted, hungry, and increasingly cut off. They could see the distant glimmer of Port Moresby at night, so close they believed they could reach it within days. Yet, at that very moment, the tide of the war was already turning far to the northeast. On the island of Guadalcanal, American Marines had dug in against a fierce Japanese counterattack. The Imperial High Command realized they could not sustain both campaigns. Supplies and reinforcements were redirected to Guadalcanal, leaving the Kokoda advance starved of support on the ground. The Japanese commander, Major General Hori, faced an impossible choice: advance without food or ammunition, or retreat. He chose survival. In late September, the order came: the Japanese would fall back across the mountains. When Australian scouts discovered the enemy was retreating, disbelief rippled through their ranks. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese forces were withdrawing. It wasn't a rout, but it was the first crack in the myth of Japanese invincibility. As the Australians began their counteroffensive, the exhausted 39th rejoined the advance. Men who had once been written off as untrained militia were now veterans, respected by the seasoned AIF troops beside them. Chase back along the track would be as brutal as the advance. The Japanese rearguard fought with fanatical tenacity. Determined to slow the pursuit, battles erupted again at Templeton's Crossing, Iora Creek, and finally Oivigarari, where the Japanese line collapsed under relentless pressure by November. The fighting had carried the Australians all the way back to the northern coast of Papua. The once victorious Japanese, starving and broken, were evacuated by Kokoda was secure. Port Moresby was safe, and the myth of the unstoppable Japanese army had died in the jungles of New Guinea as the guns fell silent. The mountains bore witness to something extraordinary, a nation that had come of age in mud, fear, and sacrifice. But the story of Kokoda was more than a military victory. It was a test of endurance, of youth turned into warriors, and of courage that defied every expectation. They called them chocolate soldiers. Too young, too green, too soft for real war. Most of the 39th Battalion were barely out of school, clerks, shop assistants, farmers. Their boots were worn, their rifles outdated, and their training brief when they first stepped onto the Kokoda Track. Some carried footballs instead of bayonets. They believed they were heading for garrison duty, not into the most savage fighting in the Pacific, but the jungle would turn them into something else. Entirely, it stripped away everything. Comfort, fear, hesitation. Each dawn brought rain, leeches, hunger, and the constant threat of death. And through it all, the men held the line, often at bayonet range, sometimes fighting with bare hands. One young private wrote in his diary, "We thought we'd never see home again, but if we were going to die, we'd die here." Together, they were boys who became men in weeks, men who became legends in months. The 39th didn't win Kokoda alone, but they gave Australia something priceless. Time for the AIF to arrive. Time for a nation to find its steel when their reinforcements finally reached them. Those chocolate soldiers looked nothing like boys. They looked like veterans, lean, hardened, eyes hollow but unbroken. The jungle had taken their youth, but it had forged their spirit. They were the face of Australia's defiance, and their endurance became the heart of Kokoda. The Owen Stanley range wasn't just terrain, it was an active combatant. Narrow ridges, thick undergrowth, and endless rain made large-scale maneuvers impossible. Tanks were useless. Artillery couldn't be dragged through. Even air support struggled to find targets under the dense canopy. For the Japanese, trained for speed and aggression, this environment turned their strengths into weaknesses. Their bayonet charges bogged down in mud. Their supply lines collapsed. Their troops, though disciplined, found their famed coordination breaking apart in the chaos of the trees. The Australians adapted fast. They used ambush tactics, surprise attacks, and quick retreats. Patrols operated in near silence. No shouting, no coughing. Even boots wrapped in cloth to muffle sound. The jungle became their shield. When Japanese troops advanced, they walked straight into kill zones, narrow paths where machine guns waited in the shadows. The enemy might take one position, only to find themselves flanked from the trees moments later. It wasn't about open battles anymore. It was about endurance. Waiting, listening, striking once and vanishing. Every meter was fought for with blood and exhaustion, and gradually, the Australians turned the terrain from a nightmare into an advantage. The jungle didn't favor the strongest. It favored those who refused to break behind. The chaos of the Kokoda campaign stood two contrasting leaders, Major General Hori of Japan and General Sir Thomas Blamey of Australia. Hori was a seasoned commander, intelligent, bold, and fiercely loyal to the Emperor. His orders were clear: advance over the mountains, seize Port Moresby, and cut Australia from America. He believed victory was certain. His men were veterans, their morale unshakable. But Hori's campaign became a lesson in the limits of willpower. The further he advanced, The longer his supply lines stretched, ammunition dwindled. Rations disappeared, and disease took hold. Yet, he pressed on, driven by duty and pride, when the retreat finally came. Ioribaiwa wept days later, attempting to escape down the flooded Komusi River. He drowned, a tragic symbol of a campaign that had gone too far. Blumi, on the other hand, was controversial. His command decisions were often criticized, and his relationship with frontline officers strained. But his field commanders, men like General George Vassy and Brigadier Arnold Potts, carried the burden of leadership, and the mud pots, in particular, embodied the Australian fight: calm, stubborn, protective of his men. When ordered to hold against impossible odds, he did, not out of blind obedience, but because retreat meant Port Moresby would fall. These leaders fought different wars, one in strategy rooms, one in the mud, but their legacies became bound to the same ridge. To understand Kokoda, one must understand the mindset of those climbing from the north. The Japanese troops who landed at Buna and Gona were among the best in the Imperial Army, veterans of China, disciplined and utterly loyal. They had been told that capturing Port Moresby would secure Japan's southern flank and open the path to war to Australia. Their commanders believed Australia was weak, a colony without backbone. The first encounters seemed to prove it. The initial Australian units retreated under the weight of Japan's offensive. Morale among Japanese ranks soared, but as the track strung, that confidence decayed. The same jungle that cloaked their advance began devouring them. Leeches, rotting feet, fever-starvation men collapsed on the trail. Too weak to carry rifles, bodies were left behind to lighten the load. When the retreat began, pride gave way to horror. Many refused to leave their wounded, knowing what awaited them: bayonets, hunger, or the jungle itself. Some wept. Others simply disappeared into the mist by the campaign's end. The Japanese were stunned for the first time in the Pacific War. They had been forced backward, not by Americans, but by Australians. Koko became a whispered name among Japanese soldiers, not as a victory, but as a warning. From youth turned to veterans, to jungles turned into weapons. Kokoda was more than a battle, it was a transformation. But every transformation demands a breaking point. Kokoda wasn't just fought with rifles and grenades. It was fought inside the human mind for both sides. Exhaustion became the greatest enemy. Sleep was rare, food scarce, and the rain unrelenting. The track was a 160-kilometer ordeal of climbs, so steep that men used vines to pull themselves upward, then slid back down the other side. Australian troops carried 30 kilograms on their backs, ammunition, rations, water, through mud waist deep. Many collapsed from malaria or dysentery. Those who could still walk dragged the wounded, refusing to abandon them. Every sound could mean death: a branch snapping, a cough, a whisper. The fear never left. The Japanese suffered even worse. They were far from supply lines, living off rotting rice and roots. Starvation haunted them. Their diaries speak of hallucinations and despair, yet both sides clung to purpose. The Australians to protect home soil, the Japanese to serve the emperor. By late October, both armies were ghosts of their former strength, but one side still had a lifeline: the villages, the carriers, and the faith that reinforcements would come. At Kokoda became the definition of endurance, not of machines or firepower, but of willpower. And in that brutal contest, endurance was the one weapon the Australians never ran out of. No account of Kokoda is complete without the Papuans. They were villagers, not soldiers, men, women, and even teenagers who became the lifeblood of the campaign. Australians called them the fuzzy wuzzy angels for their hair, their kindness, and the way they appeared from the jungle to carry the wounded to safety. They built makeshift stretchers from bamboo and vines. They waded through rivers, crossed ridges, and endured the same storms and gunfire as the soldiers they carried. Some were barefoot. Many never returned home. They didn't fight with weapons, but without them. The Australians could not have survived, one soldier later wrote. They were the difference between life and death. They would carry us for days, never asking for anything but a smile. When the last wounded man was carried from the track, many Papuans wept quietly, whispering prayers for the strangers they had saved. In a war defined by destruction, the fuzzy-wuzzy angels became a symbol of humanity. Their legacy remains inseparable from Kokoda, proof that courage wears many faces, and compassion can exist even in the darkest corners of war. In 1942, the Kokoda Track became a primitive battlefield. There were no tanks, no heavy artillery, and almost no vehicles. Everything, ammunition, medical supplies, even food, had to be carried by hand. This lack of modern technology forced both sides to fight like their ancestors, with rifles, bayonets, and raw endurance. Radio communication often failed. In the mountains, messages were sent by runners who risked ambush or exhaustion. Airdrops missed their targets and scattered supplies across ravines. A single lost crate could mean days without food. The Australians adapted quickly. They used local guides, set up forward medical posts, and relied on aerial resupply. Despite the odds, their lightweight Owen submachine gun, built for close-quarter fighting, became a game-changer. Reliable even in the rain, the Japanese, armed with Arisaka rifles and grenades, struggled when ammunition ran low. Their equipment rusted, their medical supplies spoiled in the end. The side that mastered improvisation triumphed. The Australians proved that ingenuity could overcome technology, that courage, not machines, defined victory. The jungles of New Guinea became the one place where the industrial age gave way to primal warfare, man against man, strength against nature. Before Kokoda, Australia's war felt distant, fought in North Africa, in Europe, under the banners of others. But Kokoda was different. It was fought on their doorstep, by their sons. Under their flag, the campaign reshaped the Australian identity. No longer seen as a junior partner in the Allied war effort, Australia had proven it could defend itself and stand as a force of its own. The 39th, 214th, and 216th battalions became household names. Veterans returned home, not as forgotten militia, but as heroes. The battle also changed how Australians viewed leadership, endurance, and sacrifice. It wasn't about empire anymore. It was about home. Even General MacArthur, often critical of Australian command, called Kokoda one of the most remarkable defensive efforts of the Pacific War. In the jungles of New Guinea, Australia found not just victory, but identity. The echoes of that campaign still live on in schools, memorials, and in the national spirit, a reminder that courage often comes from the most unexpected places. Every perspective, human, tactical, moral, or national, led to one truth. Kokoda was no ordinary battle. It was a turning point, not only in the war, but in Australia's story itself. By late September 1942, the Kokoda Track had become hell on earth. The mountains bled men and swallowed them whole. Rain turned the trail into a graveyard of mud, and both armies, Australian and Japanese, were running on fumes. But neither side would give up. Not yet, for the Japanese 17th Army. The orders were clear: advance on Port Moresby at all costs. For the Australians, under Brigadier Arnold Potts and later Brigadier Kenneth Either, there was only one command: hold no matter what it takes. The clash that would define Kokoda came at Ioribaiwa Ridge, the final mountain barrier before Port Moresby. If the Japanese captured it, they could see the faint glimmer of the Coral Sea beyond, a visual promise of victory. They were only 30 kilometers from their objective. The Australians dug in. They were filthy, fevered, and starving. Many could barely stand. Yet, when the Japanese attacked, they fought with a desperation born of exhaustion. Wave after wave came through the fog, bayonets flashing, rifles cracking, grenades hissing through the rain. The jungle echoed with shouts in Japanese and English, merging into one endless roar. For 2 days, the Australians clung to the ridge. They counterattacked, withdrew, then counterattacked again when ammunition ran low. They fought with bayonets and shovels. Private Bruce Kingsbury of the 214th Battalion became one of those who turned the tide, seeing his comrades faltering under the assault. Kingsbury grabbed a Bren gun, charged through enemy fire, and single-handedly drove the Japanese from their position. His courage gave the Australians breathing space, but it cost him his life. He was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the first in the New Guinea campaign still. Despite heroism, the Australians were ordered to withdraw their line had held. But Barely Potts, accused by some of retreating too soon, knew the truth. His men had nothing left to give. They staggered back toward Imita Ridge, the last defensible position before Port Moresby. It was here, on this ridge, that the tide would finally turn unknown to the exhausted Australians. Something was happening far behind enemy lines. The Japanese 17th Army was running out of everything. Supply line stretching from Rabaul to the north coast of Papua had collapsed. Allied air raids had cut off reinforcements. Their ships were being sunk faster than they could be replaced, and disease, malaria, dysentery, jungle rot, was killing more men than bullets by the time they reached Ioribaiwa. Some Japanese soldiers were eating grass, roots, even the leather from their own equipment. Ammunition was rationed to 3 bullets per man. Hori's once proud troops were starving ghosts. Then came the message that changed everything. Withdraw. Tokyo had decided to halt the advance on Port Moresby. The High Command, facing disaster at Guadalcanal, needed its forces elsewhere. Hori's men were to retreat back across the Owen Stanleys. The Japanese soldiers wept. Many refused to believe it. They had fought through jungles, mountains and rivers for 2 months, and now, within sight of their prize, they were being told to turn back. But orders were orders, and so on September 26th, the great Japanese withdrawal began for the Australians on Imita Ridge. The silence was deafening when scouts moved forward. They found the Japanese positions abandoned. Campfires still smoldered. Empty rice sacks lay scattered beside hastily dug graves. Enemy was gone. It was hard to believe after weeks of constant fighting, death, and exhaustion. The men didn't cheer. They just sat in the mud, stunned, too weak to feel victory. But the reprieve was short-lived. General Sir Thomas Blamey demanded that the Japanese not just be stopped, but driven out completely. The Australians, now reinforced by the battle-hardened AIF brigades, were ordered to pursue the hunters became the hunted through this same jungle that had nearly killed them. The Australians began their counteroffensive. The 25th Brigade led the charge, pushing north through Ifogi, Templeton's Crossing, and Iora Creek. The enemy fought a desperate rearguard action, trying to delay the inevitable, but the balance had shifted. The Australians were now stronger. Supplied by airdrops, supported by fresh troops, the Japanese were starving, broken, dying where they stood still. Every ridge, every creek, every inch of the track cost blood. At Iora Creek, the Japanese made their last major stand. The fighting was brutal, close, personal, and unrelenting. The jungle was filled with the screams of the wounded and the thunder of grenades, echoing through the trees. But when the smoke cleared, the Australians had taken the heights. The Japanese line was shattered. The tide of Kokoda had finally, unmistakably, turned. What had begun as a desperate defense had become a relentless pursuit, and for the first time in the Pacific War, Japan's aura of invincibility was gone. But victory on the track was not the end. The final reckoning waited on the northern coast, where the Australians would face their old enemy one last time in the swamps of Buna and Gonaby. Late November 1942. The Australian troops were ghosts of themselves, lean, hollow-eyed, yet burning with grim determination. They had done the impossible, driven the Japanese back across the Owen Stanleys. Now they were closing in on the coastal strongholds of Buna, Gona, and Sanananda, the very points where the enemy had first landed. This was the final act of the Kokoda campaign. The Japanese, under General Hori's successor, Colonel Yokoyama, were entrenched deep within fortified positions, pillboxes of logs, palm trunks and earth. They had constructed interlocking fields of fire, camouflaged bunkers, and sniper nests hidden in the mangroves. Machine guns overlooked every approach. Swamps replaced open ground, forcing the Australians to wade waist-deep through water under constant fire. It was a nightmare of mud, disease, and death. The men of the 7th Division, alongside American units of the 32nd Infantry Division, advanced into what one soldier called a living hell. Every inch forward cost lives. Every tree, every mound could hide a machine gun nest. Private Arthur Bluey Dunlop wrote in his diary, "You don't see them until they kill you. The smell never leaves. Mud, blood, and something worse. You crawl through the slime and hope it's not your turn." The first major contact came at Gona. The 21st Brigade attacked on November 19th. Expecting light resistance, what they found was a fortress. The Japanese had dug in so deeply that artillery shells barely scratched the surface. Machine guns cut down entire platoons. Wounded men lay in the mud, unable to move. While their mates tried to drag them out under fire, the Australians attacked again and again. But the bunkers simply wouldn't fall for days. They clawed their way forward, sometimes just 10 meters at a time. Finally, on December 9th, after nearly 3 weeks of bloodshed, they broke through. Gona fell when the Australians moved in. They found over 600 Japanese dead. Many of them had refused to surrender, fighting to the last bullet, or committing suicide in their trenches. The ground was littered with bayonets, helmets, and the remains of men who had refused to retreat. But victory at Gona was only one piece of the nightmare at Buna. The Americans faced an even more ferocious defense. They were inexperienced in jungle warfare, poorly equipped for the conditions, and utterly unprepared for the fanatical resistance of the Japanese. Their early attacks failed disastrously. Entire squads disappeared in the swamps. Australian officers watching from nearby described the battlefield as a slaughterhouse. General Robert Eichelberger, sent by General MacArthur to take command, issued the now famous order, "You will take Buna, or you will not come back alive." Slowly, painfully, with the help of Australian reinforcements and better coordination, the line began to move. Flamethrowers were used to burn out bunkers, tanks, lumbering and often bog-blasted holes in enemy lines. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand in the trenches. By January 2, 1943, Buna too had fallen. The last stronghold, Sanananda, was the most hellish of all swamps, so deep men drowned in them. Mosquitoes thick as rain. The stench of rotting bodies hung over the battlefield. The Japanese, starving and diseased, refused to surrender. They clutched their rifles even as they collapsed from hunger. He was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the first in the New Guinea campaign. Still, despite heroism, the Australians were ordered to withdraw. Their line had held. But Barely Potts, accused by some of retreating too soon, knew the truth. His men had nothing left to give. They staggered back toward Imita Ridge, the last defensible position before Port Moresby. It was here, on this ridge, that the tide would finally turn. Unknown to the exhausted Australians, something was happening far behind enemy lines. The Japanese 17th Army was running out of everything. Their supply line, stretching from Rabaul to the north coast of Papua, had collapsed. Allied air raids had cut off reinforcements. Their ships were being sunk faster than they could be replaced, and disease, malaria, dysentery, jungle rot, was killing more men than bullets by the time they reached Ioribaiwa. Some Japanese soldiers were eating grass, roots, even the leather from their own equipment. Ammunition was rationed to 3 bullets per man. Hori's once proud troops were starving ghosts. Then came the message that changed everything. Withdraw. Tokyo had decided to halt the advance on Port Moresby. The High Command, facing disaster at Guadalcanal, needed its forces elsewhere. Hori's men were to retreat back across the Owen Stanleys. The Japanese soldiers wept. Many refused to believe it. They had fought through jungles, mountains and rivers for 2 months, and now, within sight of their prize, they were being told to turn back, but orders were orders, and so, on September 26th, the great Japanese withdrawal began for the Australians on Amita Ridge. The silence was deafening when scouts moved forward. They found the Japanese positions abandoned, campfires still smoldered. Empty rice sacks lay scattered beside hastily dug graves. Enemy was gone. It was hard to believe after weeks of constant fighting. Death and exhaustion. The men didn't cheer. They just sat in the mud, stunned. Too weak to feel victory. But the reprieve was short-lived. General Sir Thomas Blamey demanded that the Japanese not just be stopped, but driven out completely. The Australians, now reinforced by the battle-hardened AIF brigades, were ordered to pursue the hunters became the hunted through the same jungle that had nearly killed them. The Australians began their counter-offensive. The 25th Brigade led the charge, pushing north through Ifogi, Templeton's Crossing, and Iora Creek. The enemy fought a desperate rearguard action, trying to delay the inevitable, but the balance had shifted. The Australians were now stronger. Supplied by airdrops, supported by fresh troops, the Japanese were starving, broken, dying where they stood still. Every ridge, every creek, every inch of the track cost blood. At Iora Creek, the Japanese made their last major stand. The fighting was brutal, close, personal, and unrelenting. The jungle was filled with the screams of the wounded and the thunder of grenades, echoing through the trees. But when the smoke cleared, the Australians had taken the heights. The Japanese line was shattered. The tide of Kokoda had finally, unmistakably, turned. What had begun as a desperate defense had become a relentless pursuit, and for the first time in the Pacific War, Japan's aura of invincibility was gone. But victory on the track was not the end. The final reckoning waited on the northern coast, where the Australians would face their old enemy one last time in the swamps of Buna and Gonaby. Late November 1942. The Australian troops were ghosts of themselves, lean, hollow-eyed, yet burning with grim determination. They had done the impossible, driven the Japanese back across the Owen Stanleys now. They were closing in on the coastal strongholds of Buna, Gona, and Sanananda, the very points where the enemy had first landed. This was the final act of the Kokoda campaign. The Japanese, under General Hori's successor, Colonel Yokoyama, were entrenched deep within fortified positions, pillboxes of logs, palm trunks, and earth. They had constructed interlocking fields of fire, camouflaged bunkers, and sniper nests hidden in the mangroves. Machine guns overlooked every approach. Swamps replaced open ground, forcing the Australians to wade waist-deep through water under constant fire. It was a nightmare of mud, disease, and death. The men of the 7th Division, alongside American units of the 32nd Infantry Division, advanced into what one soldier called a living hell. Every inch forward cost lives. Every tree, every mound could hide a machine gun nest. Private Arthur Bluey Dunlop wrote in his diary, "You don't see them until they kill you. The smell never leaves. Mud, blood, and something worse. You crawl through the slime and hope it's not your turn." The first major contact came at Gona. The 21st Brigade attacked on November 19th. Expecting light resistance, what they found was a fortress. The Japanese had dug in so deeply that artillery shells barely scratched the surface. Machine guns cut down entire platoons. Wounded men lay in the mud, unable to move, while their mates tried to drag them out under fire. The Australians attacked again and again, but the bunkers simply wouldn't fall for days. They clawed their way forward, sometimes just 10 meters at a time. Finally, on December 9th, after nearly 3 weeks of bloodshed, they broke through. Gona fell when the Australians moved in. They found over 600 Japanese dead. Many of them had refused to surrender, fighting to the last bullet, or committing suicide in their trenches. The ground was littered with bayonets, helmets, and the remains of men who had refused to retreat. But victory at Gona was only one piece of the nightmare at Buna. The Americans faced an even more ferocious defense. They were inexperienced in jungle warfare, poorly equipped for the conditions, and utterly unprepared for the fanatical resistance of the Japanese. Their early attacks failed disastrously. Entire squads disappeared in the swamps. Australian officers watching from nearby described the battlefield as a slaughterhouse. General Robert Eichelberger, sent by General MacArthur to take command, issued the now famous order, "You will take Buna, or you will not come back alive," slowly, painfully. With the help of Australian reinforcements and better coordination, the line began to move. Flamethrowers were used to burn out bunkers, tanks, lumbering, and often bombed blasted holes in enemy lines. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand in the trenches. By January 2, 1943, Buna too had fallen. The last stronghold, Sanananda, was the most hellish of all swamps, so deep men drowned in them, mosquitoes thick as rain. The stench of rotting bodies hung over the battlefield. The Japanese, starving and diseased, refused to surrender. They clutched their rifles even as they collapsed from hunger. One Australian officer described it simply, "We were fighting ghosts. They were already dead. They just didn't know it." By mid-January, it was over. The Kokoda Trail, from Port Moresby to the northern beaches, was finally in Allied hands of the 13,500 Japanese who had landed months earlier. Fewer than 2,000 were left alive. Most had died of disease, starvation, or wounds. Many had been buried in the mud of the jungle that had devoured them. For the Australians, victory came at a terrible cost. Over 600 dead, thousands wounded or sick, yet their triumph was more than a military victory. It was psychological. For the first time, the Japanese army, the same force that had swept across Asia and the Pacific, had been defeated in a major land campaign. Myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered when the news reached home. Australia erupted in pride and grief. Prime Minister John Curtin called the men of Kokoda the backbone of our nation. Newspapers declared, "They stopped the enemy at our doorstep." For many soldiers, however, there was little joy. They had seen too much. Private Stan Bissett of the 214th Battalion later recalled, "You don't feel like a hero when your best mate dies beside you. You just keep moving. Because if you stop, you'll go mad." The jungle had taken everything: innocence, laughter, and friends, but it had also forged something unbreakable: courage in the face of hopeless odds. When the campaign ended, the men who survived marched quietly back through the mountains they had once defended. The track was silent now, except for the soft rhythm of boots on mud. Many stopped at Isurava, where so many had fallen, and stood before the rough crosses marking their mates' graves. Someone had carved 4 words into a wooden memorial there, words that would forever define the Kokoda spirit: courage, endurance, mateship, sacrifice. For the Japanese, the defeat was devastating. It marked the first major setback of their ground forces in the Pacific. From then on, their advance would never again reach Australian soil. For the Australians and New Zealanders who fought alongside them, Kokoda became more than just a battle. It was a symbol that ordinary men, untested and outnumbered, could stand against the darkness and prevail. The jungles of New Guinea had become a crucible, and from its fire, a legend was born. When the guns finally fell silent over New Guinea, the jungle kept its secrets. The dead lay buried where they had fallen, under tangled vines, beside rivers, or beneath hastily dug crosses. The air was heavy with decay, but also with something deeper: the quiet relief of survival. For the Australians who had fought along the Kokoda Track, the word victory felt strange. There had been no cheering, no parade, only exhaustion, mud, and the memory of faces that would never return home. Campaign had lasted from July 1942 to January 1943, 6 months of unrelenting combat through terrain so brutal it killed almost as many men as bullets. The 39th Battalion, the militia unit that had first faced the Japanese at Isurava, had been reduced to fewer than 50 fighting men. Entire companies had simply ceased to exist. Medical officers estimated that for every soldier killed in combat, 5 more were struck down by malaria, dysentery, dengue, or jungle rot. Supplies had often been carried by the legendary Papuan carriers, who risked their lives daily to bring food and ammunition forward and carry the wounded back. The Australians called them the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, a name spoken with deep affection and respect. Corporal Bill Stewart later recalled, "You'd hear them coming through the mist, quiet, steady, carrying a mate on a stretcher made of bamboo. They never left a man behind, never, without them." The campaign might have collapsed entirely for Japan. Kokoda was a blow that reverberated across the empire. The defeat marked the end of Japan's southern advance. Port Moresby, the intended springboard for an invasion of Australia, was now out of reach. Imperial headquarters in Tokyo downplayed the loss, calling it a strategic withdrawal. But within the ranks, officers knew the truth. The Japanese 17th Army had been broken. Thousands of their best soldiers had died in the jungle without supplies, air cover, or reinforcements. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japan had been forced onto the defensive. The psychological shift was immense. Until then, the Japanese army had seemed unstoppable, from China to Singapore, from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies. But at Kokoda, a force of poorly equipped Australians, some barely out of school, had stopped them cold. The myth of Japanese invincibility died on that mountain trail at home. The Australian government used Kokoda as a rallying symbol. The country had felt vulnerable since the fall of Singapore and the bombing of Darwin. But Kokoda changed that narrative. Newspapers declared, "The sons of Anzac have stood firm once more." Public morale soared. Recruitment rose. The campaign gave Australians a sense of identity, independent of Britain, for the first time. They had defended their own soil under their own flag. The parallels with Gallipoli were inevitable. Both battles had been fought under impossible conditions. Both had demanded unimaginable endurance. But Kokoda was different. Gallipoli had been a tragic defeat. Kokoda was survival. Victory earned through suffering, in military terms. The Kokoda campaign also reshaped Allied strategy in the Pacific. It proved that Japan could be defeated on land, not just by overwhelming naval power or bombing, but by infantry in the jungle. From this point on, Australian and American forces refined their jungle warfare tactics: small unit maneuvers, close-quarter fighting, and air-dropped resupply. New training schools were established in Queensland to prepare troops for similar campaigns across the Pacific. Men who had fought at Kokoda were often reassigned as instructors. They taught new recruits how to move, fight, and survive in the jungle, how to listen to the silence, smell ambushes before they happen, and use the terrain as a weapon. What had been learned in agony on the slopes of the Owen Stanleys became the foundation of Australia's future victories. From Shaggy Ridge to Bougainvilleas, the war moved north toward the Philippines and eventually to Japan. The jungles of Papua grew quiet again, but for those who had fought there, Kokoda never ended. The nightmares followed them home, the mud, the rain, the faces of lost friends. Many veterans struggled to speak about it. They simply said, "You had to be there," and yet, deep down, every man who had walked that track knew what it meant, not just for Australia, but for the entire war. Kokoda had changed everything. Years after the final shots echoed through the Owen Stanley Range, the jungle began reclaiming what men had built and destroyed. The rusted remnants of rifles, helmets, and canteens sank beneath the vines. The old villages that once served as battlefields returned to silence, haunted only by the whispers of the dead. But Kokoda refused to fade into history for the men who had survived. The trail remained etched in memory, a place of pain and pride. Many returned home changed forever, carrying scars that could not be seen. Some never spoke about it. Others found their voices decades later, in quiet RSL halls and family living rooms. They told their children about the endless mud, the rain that never stopped, the fear that came with every rustle in the jungle. Those who walked the track after the war said it still felt alive, as if the spirits of the fallen lingered beneath the mist. Watching over the land they had defended, the official recognition of the Kokoda campaign came slowly for years. It was overshadowed by the larger, more famous battles of the Pacific, Guadalcanal, Midway, Iwo Jima. But among Australians, Kokoda became something deeper, something personal. In 1949, Prime Minister Ben Chifley called it the most significant battle fought by Australians in the Pacific War. Military historians agreed strategically. It had prevented a Japanese foothold in Papua, securing Australia's northern approaches symbolically. It had defined a generation. To many veterans, Kokoda was not about grand strategy or glory. It was about endurance, about standing firm when everything said to fall back. In the decades that followed, remembrance took form. Memorials were built in Melbourne, Sydney, and Port Moresby. The names of small, once forgotten villages, Isurava, Afogi, Ioribaiwa, Oivi, Deniki, were carved into stone, remembered alongside Gallipoli and Tobruk in the 1990s. The Kokoda Track itself was rediscovered by a new generation. Trekking it became a rite of passage, not for soldiers, but for ordinary Australians seeking to understand what their ancestors had endured. They walked the same narrow trails, crossed the same rivers, climbed the same mountains. Many broke down in tears when they reached Isurava, where a granite memorial stands bearing 4 words that sum up the campaign: courage, endurance, mateship, sacrifice. Those words had been chosen by the veterans themselves. They were not about conquest, they were about character. Japanese veterans also returned to Kokoda in later years. Some wept openly at the graves of their comrades, finally acknowledging the futility of the campaign in quiet ceremonies. Australians and Japanese stood side by side, sharing silence instead of gunfire. There were no victors left, only survivors. The reconciliation between former enemies became one of the most powerful legacies of Kokoda. It showed that respect could grow from tragedy, that understanding could take root where hatred once lived. By the 2000s, the Kokoda Track had become sacred ground. The Australian government recognized it as a national symbol, preserving it through joint efforts with Papua New Guinea. Each year, thousands of trekkers, soldiers, students, and families make the pilgrimage, walking 96 kilometers through the same wilderness that once swallowed armies. They do not walk to celebrate war, but to remember resilience. When they reach the end of the track at Ower's Corner, many look back over the misty mountains and feel something timeless: pride, sorrow, humility, because Kokoda is not just history, it is identity today. The campaign is studied in military academies worldwide. It is remembered not for scale, but for spirit, not for power, but for perseverance. The young Australian militiamen, dismissed as amateurs, outnumbered and outgunned, had achieved what seasoned armies had failed to do elsewhere. They stopped the Japanese advance cold. In one of the harshest environments on Earth, their victory at Kokoda reshaped the Pacific War and redefined what it meant to fight for home. And as the last of the veterans pass away, their legacy remains, whispered by the wind through the jungle trees, echoing in the rain over the mountains. The battle is over, but the story of Kokoda will never fade. The story of Kokoda is not just the story of a battle, it is the story of ordinary men who refused to yield. They were not professional soldiers. They were sons, brothers, and friends who left their homes believing they were going to defend a faraway outpost, only to find themselves standing between an empire and their homeland against the weight of exhaustion, disease, and fear. They found something unbreakable within themselves. It was not anger that drove them, nor hatred, but a quiet determination, the will to endure when everything around them demanded surrender. In the mud and mist of New Guinea, the Australian spirit was tested, and Proven Kokoda became more than a military victory. It became a mirror reflecting what courage looks like when stripped of glory. It showed that valor is not born on parade grounds, but in the moments when men stand their ground with nothing left to give. For Japan, the campaign was a turning point, a painful lesson that even the mightiest armies could be humbled by terrain, weather, and the will of those defending their home. For Australia, it became a national legend, a symbol of unity, sacrifice, and quiet pride. Today, when the sun rises over the Owen Stanley Range and the mist drifts between the trees, it touches both the graves of the fallen and the footprints of the living. Each drop of rain, each whisper of wind carries the memory of those who fought here, both Australian and Japanese, and in that silence lies the true legacy of Kokoda. Not victory, not defeat, but remembrance of courage forged in suffering, of humanity rediscovered in war's darkest hour. Because long after the guns fell silent, Kokoda remained more than a place. It became a testament to what men can endure and what they must never forget.